I'd like to begin by thanking the Rector for his invitation to be here today. It is always a pleasure to visit this congregation, community here, and I always receive such a warm welcome, which I appreciate greatly. I'd also like to thank the community here for its continuing generous support of the work of the Anglican Board of Mission. Without your support, we could not do the work that we do. And finally, and by no means the least, I bring a special greeting. I returned late on Friday night from Papua New Guinea, where I had spent part of the week with the acting Archbishop, Bishop Nathan Ingham. Bishop Nathan asked me where I was preaching on Sunday and asked me to bring his special greetings to the parish here and to assure the parish that he remembers with great affection his time here and also continues to remember you in his prayers. May your word live in us and bear much fruit to your glory. A voice crying in the wilderness. There is a certain irony embedded in the oracle from Isaiah which we heard today. One voice is described, but in fact there are different voices which shape the evolving interpretation of the oracle over the centuries and develop for us the sense of Advent. In the first place, there is the obscure 8th century BCE prophet Isaiah, whose name has been given to a collection of oracles and related reflections which began with the prophet and seem to have been added to for the next 8 centuries. To this originating voice, we can discern a sense of watching as its audience is called to observe the signs and their consequences. A new voice enters the text through the anonymous 6th century follower of Isaiah, to whom is attributed a new series of oracles, including the one we have heard today. Here lies a sense of waiting. We await the predicted signs which demonstrate God's salvation is upon us. A third voice emerges in that of the Baptist, who bestows upon the oracle a sense of witnessing. John and his actions, which are shaped by this prophecy, are a witness to the Messiah who has now come. Then finally, there is the voice of the author of this gospel and its community, who reflected on this oracle now in the full knowledge of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Here we begin to detect a call to mission, a call to work together with God to realise fully the gift of our salvation. Watching, waiting, witnessing, and working together. A good theological introduction to Advent. But let us earth this in a little more in the here and now. Watching. We're in the second week of our October pilgrimage to Sri Lanka, before we actually saw the country's renowned tea plantations. We had agreed that the best way to do this was by train, and so we had arrived at a station in the Southern Highlands around midday and eagerly awaited the trip. We were not disappointed. The station itself was an experience, and on departing we quickly found ourselves in the tropical, if somewhat rugged, rainforests of Sri Lanka, so lush and verdant, and spread so abundantly across the high hills and small mountains. We passed through a tunnel, and as we emerged, the vista had changed totally. For there before us, as far as we could see, was tea, and more tea, planted and pruned, almost manicured, in what appeared to be a carpet of green laid in every direction. As I looked at the landscape, I marvelled at how this type of cultivation had softened much of the ruggedness of the terrain, and the words of today's oracle came to mind. And every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the rough places shall become level ways. Waiting. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. The first voices I heard on my arrival in Sri Lanka belonged to 3 Sri Lankan youth who were arguing with each other and at the same time trying to negotiate an agreement with me to carry my case. Now, I am fairly self-reliant, and my response on this occasion was that service was not needed. At the hotel, there was a more orderly and less competitive approach by staff to provide a similar service to all the pilgrims. As we began to decline the offer, we were challenged by one of our colleagues to remember that these youth were overwhelmingly the children of tea pickers. They worked at hotels and other places, often for not much more than cheap board and lodging. To let them provide a service and be given a tip would benefit not only them, but also their families back on the plantations. For the tea pickers were among the poorest of the poor. Little did I realise at the time that these first voices would continue to resonate through the rest of the pilgrimage. On the next day, we joined with the staff of the Diocese of Colombo to be briefed on their vision and priorities for mission. To the surprise of most of us, once more, the plight of the tea pickers, who now had a name, the Malachi Magol, was high on the list. In the 1800s, British colonialists arriving in Sri Lanka with the purpose of establishing plantations, coffee was high on the list, but with slavery having been abolished, this labour-intensive industry struggled to find the human resources it required. Sri Lankans showed little interest, and in time a decision was taken to import labour from southern India. A population of Hindu low-caste Indians from a region in Tamil Nadu were identified. They were poor and often bound by debt to local landowners, and so the option to migrate, with a few incentives added, was attractive and taken up by some thousands of workers. In the 1850s, the coffee industry collapsed, and in its wake, tea production found a home, and over the next 20 years, plantations became an increasingly important feature of the Sri Lankan economy and landscape. Over time, the plantations grew larger in size and smaller in number, and the tea pickers became focused in increasingly isolated communities whose basic needs were regulated largely by their employer. They had little reason to leave the estate or to have contact with the broader Sri Lankan society. They were powerless, stateless, excluded, and largely forgotten. In fact, it is still possible to meet people who have never ventured off the estate on which they were born. In 2021, a United Nations report described the conditions for many of the Malachi Makol as being squalid, and their economic dependency was identified as a form of contemporary slavery. Witnessing, and the crooked shall become straight. Given the civil conflict over many decades within Sri Lanka and the widespread deprivation, it is not hard to understand why the plight of these people has not been much on anyone's radar. There have been attempts by some civil society groups to address their lack of rights, but progress has been elusive. In recent years, it has been the churches, including the Anglican Church, which have sought to highlight the legal and educational barriers which they suffer. There is little adequate educational infrastructure on the plantations, and the prioritising of boys ensures that women and girls have little opportunity to improve their quality of life. In 2023, the churches, joined by representatives from other religious traditions, undertook a 250-kilometre walk, starting on the north coast where the Tamils first arrived. They journeyed south on the trail those people had taken exactly 200 years before to raise the plight of their descendants. Working together, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. The Anglican Church in Sri Lanka has committed itself to continue to advocate on behalf of the Malachi Makol, and has asked ABM to support these efforts by advocating here and at home and internationally. Perhaps more significantly, the church has committed itself to improving educational opportunities for girls. To date, this has largely been in the form of a growing number of scholarships which allow bright students to leave the plantations and board at church schools. These scholarships are actually funded by the churches. But in reality, work to build educational infrastructure on or close to the tea estates is much needed. Consequently, it was pleasing that as one outcome from the pilgrimage, ABM has been able to commit funding for a new school in the Diocese of Kurunegala, which will be of more direct benefit. Today, I want to commend the growth of this work and that of ABM to your prayers as we begin to celebrate our 175th anniversary and renew our vision for our next 25 years. Let me add as a postscript, while I was in the kitchen after the first service, people came to me and said, "But what can we do?" And they looked at it, one of them looked at a tea bag and they said, "You know, every time we have a cup of tea, why can't we pray for the tea pickers?" The Lord be with you.